We all have that moment when someone crosses a line, maybe not once, but again and again. And we tell ourselves it's not that bad until it is. Toxic people don't always show up in obvious ways. Sometimes they're the ones who joke at your expense and call it humor. Sometimes they're the ones who wrap manipulation and charm. But here's the truth. Their power isn't in what they do, it's in what we don't do. One of the most powerful shifts we can make when dealing with toxic people is this: focus on the behavior, not the identity. It's tempting, especially when we feel hurt or backed into a corner, to label someone as manipulative, selfish, narcissistic, or toxic. Those words might feel like justice in the moment, but here's the problem: they often shut the door on real change and clarity. When we label the person, we make it personal. And when we make it personal, we usually ignite defensiveness, not accountability. But when we name the pattern, when we say, I've noticed that when I share something vulnerable, you make a joke at my expense, or you tend to shift the blame when things get hard, we do something infinitely more powerful. We bring the behavior into the light without making it about character assassination. We create a mirror, not a hammer. Because here's the truth: toxic people often operate in the shadows of ambiguity. They thrive when no one calls out the patterns. They count on your silence, your self-doubt, your discomfort. But the minute you shine a light on the pattern, the power shifts. Not because you're controlling them, but because you're finally standing firmly in your own clarity. Naming the pattern is also a radical act of self-respect. You're saying, I trust my experience, I trust my gut, and I don't need you to validate that this hurts or feels off. I know that it does. That is emotional adulthood. That is boundary work at its finest. Now, I'm not saying it's easy. There's a cost to being clear. People might get uncomfortable. They might deny it, deflect, or double down. But here's the gift in it all. Once the pattern is named, it can't be unseen. The game is different now. You've changed the rules just by telling the truth. You don't have to scream. You don't have to explain for hours. One sentence can shift the atmosphere. This is a pattern I'm seeing and I'm not okay with it. No one can argue with your reality when it's expressed with grounded clarity. That's not drama, that's dignity. And here's the magic: when you start naming patterns, you'll find out really quickly who respects your boundaries and who is only ever there for your silence. You only need to do it once to see everything more clearly. So don't attack the person, illuminate the behavior. That's where change begins, and where toxic people start to lose their grip. Saying no, setting limits, deciding what we will and won't accept. These are not acts of cruelty or distance. These are the foundational acts of self-respect. They're the guardrails we place around our emotional health, our time, and our peace. Here's the hard truth: if you don't have boundaries, you are handing out invitations to resentment. Without boundaries, we start saying yes when we mean no. We start absorbing other people's chaos as our own. We let things slide that violate our values, and all of it chips away at our self-worth. It's not dramatic, it's not even loud. It's quiet erosion. Boundaries are not walls to keep people out. They're the fences that protect what matters inside. Think about it. You don't put a fence around something worthless. You put it around a garden, around a home, around something that you are actively tending to and trying to grow. Boundaries are the same. You set them because you value the space they protect. Now, here's where toxic people come in. They test boundaries like toddlers test bedtime. They push, they prod, they use guilt, shame, charm, silence, anything to get you to move the line. And the moment you show that the line is flexible, that's the moment you lose control of the relationship dynamic. But here's the truth that might sting a little. Toxic people don't actually violate your boundaries. They test them, and we violate them ourselves when we abandon them. And that's what makes setting a boundary once such a game changer. When you say, I'm not okay with being spoken to like that, or this conversation can continue only if it's respectful, you aren't just asking someone else to change. You are telling yourself the truth about what you're worth. Boundaries say, I matter too. My peace isn't up for negotiation. I don't need to over-explain to be valid. You might lose people when you start setting boundaries, but here's the deal. The people you lose for having boundaries were never safe to be around without them. Boundaries don't keep love out, they keep harm out. And the people who love you, truly love you, will adapt, not resist. They will respect the shape of your soul, not try to stretch it into what's convenient for them. So if you want toxic people to stop bothering you, if you want to stop being a magnet for manipulation, for chaos, for emotional drain, start with this. Set one clear boundary and honor it like it's sacred, because it is, because you are. And that boundary, that one moment of truth, it's not selfish, it's not rude. It's your spine, it's your strength. It's the backbone of self-respect, and it will hold you up when everything else tries to pull you down. We stay quiet to keep the peace. We bite our tongues so we don't cause drama. We smile through the discomfort because we're afraid of being labeled as too sensitive, too much, or too emotional. But what we're really doing deep down is abandoning ourselves, and that comes at a high cost. When we silence our truth in the name of harmony, we create a war inside ourselves. We put everyone else's comfort ahead of our own emotional safety. We betray that small, sacred voice inside that says, this isn't okay. And here's the painful irony. The longer we keep quiet, the louder the resentment grows. Let's be clear, silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is fear wearing a mask. Sometimes silence is survival strategy we learned in childhood. But as adults, as people trying to live wholehearted, courageous lives, silence becomes a cage. And every time we swallow our voice, we reinforce the lie that our feelings don't matter. And toxic people, they count on your silence. They depend on your hesitation. They weaponize your politeness. Because when you stay quiet, you give them the space to keep crossing the line without consequence. Speaking up doesn't have to mean yelling or blaming. It doesn't have to be perfect or poetic. It can be as simple as saying, I didn't feel okay with what happened. That sit right with me. This isn't working for me anymore. And yes, your voice might shake. That doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're doing something brave. Because reclaiming your voice after silencing it for so long is an act of radical self-love. We don't always speak up because we're afraid of the fallout. What if they leave? What if they get angry? What if it changes everything? But here's the better question. What if nothing changes and you keep abandoning yourself to protect them? What if the real damage isn't what might happen if you speak, but what will happen if you keep shrinking? There is a version of you that is waiting just on the other side of your silence. That version doesn't tolerate emotional manipulation. That version doesn't bend over backwards for approval. That version doesn't carry the weight of other people's discomfort like it's her job. That version tells the truth. Kindly, clearly, courageously. So if you're wondering how to make toxic people stop bothering you, how to get off the emotional roller coaster once and for all, here's one powerful place to begin. Stop silencing yourself just to be liked, needed, or kept, because your voice isn't dangerous. Your honesty isn't offensive. Your truth isn't a threat. It's your freedom. And the first time you use it with clarity, it will hurt, but it will also heal. Silence can feel safe. Your voice is sacred. Use it. If you want to understand why toxic people have such a grip on us, you have to understand shame. Because shame is their favorite tool, and secrecy is their playground. Shame says, you're not enough. Shame says, you deserved it. Shame says, you're overreacting. Shame whispers, don't tell anyone, you'll look weak. Toxic people count on those whispers. They thrive in environments where no one calls out the pain, where everyone pretends, performs, and stays silent, because as long as you stay silent, they stay in control. But here's the radical truth. Shame is like mold. It only grows in the dark. The moment you expose it to light, truth, conversation, connection, it begins to wither. Let me say that again, because it's everything. Shame cannot survive being spoken. When you name your experience out loud, when you say, that felt manipulative, or I was shamed in that moment, or that interaction made me question my worth, you do something extraordinary. You take the power back. You reclaim the narrative. Because what shame needs to survive is secrecy and isolation. But what you're giving it instead is language and connection. And that changes everything. Here's what toxic people fear more than confrontation. They fear being seen clearly. They fear you having the words to describe what they've tried to confuse you about. Because once you name the dynamic, the game is up. Once you say, this isn't love, this is control, or this isn't support, it's manipulation, you force the truth into the room, and that truth has weight. You don't need to shout it. You don't need to make a scene. You just need to speak it clearly and calmly. Because when you speak shame, you shrink it. When you speak the truth, you unmask the behavior. And when you unmask the behavior, you break the pattern. Let's be honest, many of us stay quiet because we've been conditioned to believe that naming harm is dramatic or ungrateful or disrespectful. But the truth is, silence is not maturity. Silence is not grace. Silence is complicity, especially when it keeps us trapped in someone else's dysfunction. Speaking doesn't make you weak, it makes you free. It doesn't mean you're trying to hurt them, it means you've decided to stop hurting yourself. So here's a powerful step that can shift everything. Speak what happened. Speak how it made you feel. Speak the shame that's been lingering in the corners of your mind. Because the moment you say it out loud to a trusted friend, to a therapist, to yourself in the mirror, that toxic person's grip on you starts to loosen. They may try to twist it, they may try to gaslight or guilt you, but once the truth is spoken, you can't unknow it. You can't unsee it, and you won't be as easy to manipulate ever again. Say it once, own it once. And you begin the process of becoming untouchable, not because you're hard, but because you're clear. Toxic people hate clarity. Shame hates the light. And your voice is the flashlight that will lead you out of the dark. Let's get one thing straight. Using your voice doesn't make you aggressive. It makes you clear. So many of us have been conditioned, especially those who identify as kind, empathetic, or emotionally intelligent, to believe that using our voice is somehow mean, abrasive, or too much. We've been told to keep the peace, to let it go, or to just be the bigger person. But here's the reality. Peace that comes at the cost of your truth is not peace. It's quiet suffering. And there's nothing noble about that. Your voice isn't a weapon unless you use it to wound. But when you use it to express, to protect, and to clarify, your voice becomes a boundary, a line in the sand that says, I will no longer trade my emotional safety for someone else's comfort. Toxic people will try to make you feel guilty for speaking up. That's part of the playbook. They'll say, you're overreacting, too sensitive, or trying to start drama. But don't be fooled. What they're really reacting to is your clarity. Because when you stop being confused about what's okay and what's not, their control begins to slip. Using your voice isn't about calling someone out. It's about calling yourself back into alignment, back into dignity, back into your own emotional integrity. It can sound as simple as, that didn't sit right with me. I need some space after that conversation. Please don't speak to me like that again. Notice, that's not a threat. That's not an attack. That's a boundary. Firm, clear, respectful. It's not about volume. It's about intention. You don't have to raise your voice to be heard. You just have to stop shrinking it. There will be people who don't like this version of you. The version that uses her voice. The version that says what she means without apologizing for it. The version that doesn't smooth over other people's rough behavior anymore. Let them go. Because when you stop using silence to keep people close, you start attracting people who respect your words, who welcome your honesty, and who don't confuse your boundaries with betrayal. You don't need to turn your pain into poison. You don't need to shout to prove your point. You just need to trust that your voice is enough to speak, not to punish, but to protect, not to overpower, but to be understood, not to control, but to connect with the version of yourself who no longer tolerates emotional harm. They're built on repeated interactions, subtle power imbalances, unspoken rules, quiet agreements that are made over time. You say yes when you mean no. You laugh off the hurtful joke. You accept the apology without changed behavior. You stay silent to avoid being labeled too sensitive. That's the pattern. And over time, that pattern becomes the relationship. Now, here's what's hard to admit. The pattern keeps repeating because in some way it's being allowed, not because you're weak, not because you're broken, but because you're human, and humans often default to familiar behaviors, especially when they fear conflict or rejection. But here's the powerful truth. The moment you change the pattern, you change the entire power dynamic. You don't have to yell. You don't have to plead. You don't even have to explain. You just have to do something different. Say no when you usually say yes. Pause instead of reacting. Walk away instead of defending. Speak up instead of staying quiet. That single shift, even the smallest one, can cause the entire system to wobble. Right? Because toxic people rely on predictability. They count on your compliance. They feel powerful because the pattern has always played in their favor. When you interrupt that pattern, you interrupt their control. You stop feeding the loop, and suddenly they're left standing in the space where your old self used to accommodate them, and they don't know what to do with this new version of you. They may get louder. They may guilt trip you. They may try to pull you back into the role you used to play, but don't mistake resistance for proof that you're doing it wrong. It's proof that you're doing it differently, and differently is how freedom begins. Change doesn't happen through confrontation alone. It happens through consistency. When you make a new choice again and again, the pattern breaks. And when the pattern breaks, the power shifts back to you. You stop being reactive. You stop being available for emotional games. You stop accepting disrespect as a form of love. And here's the most beautiful part. You don't just change the pattern for that one relationship. You change the pattern for your whole life. You raise the standard. You build the muscle of self-trust. You become a person who doesn't entertain toxicity not because you're angry, but because you're clear. So if you're asking yourself, how do I make toxic people stop bothering me? Start here. Change one pattern, just one. The words you use, the boundary you set, the way you respond, the energy you give. Because when the pattern changes, the old power no longer works. And when the power shifts, so do you, into someone grounded, whole, and untouchable in the ways that truly matter. When you name the pattern, not the person, you shift from blame to clarity. When you set a boundary, you reclaim your self-respect. When you break the silence, you end your own betrayal. When you speak shame out loud, you take away its oxygen. And when you have one brave conversation, you silence 1,000 silent arguments you've been having in your head and heart. You only need to do it once, because that one act of courage draws a line in the sand, and people will either meet you on the side of truth or they'll walk away. Either way, you win. The work isn't about becoming harder, it's about becoming truer. It's not about burning bridges, it's about building boundaries. It's not about proving anything to them, it's about promising something to yourself. I will never abandon my voice, my worth, or my peace again just to make someone else more comfortable. You are allowed to protect your energy. You are allowed to expect respect. You are allowed to walk away. So speak once with clarity, with love, with strength, and let that be the moment that changes everything. Because when you choose truth over tolerance, boundaries over burnout, and courage over comfort, toxic people don't get to decide who you are anymore. You do.